When Sarah and Jack found their dream home, they couldn't believe their luck. It was a charming two-story house on a quiet suburban street, with a picket fence, a lush backyard. When Sarah decided to move into her childhood home after her parents passed away, after months of searching, this place felt like a fresh start, a sanctuary for them and their young daughter, the old Victorian house. The house was everything they had hoped for. Its wide windows always feeling like home. Friendly enough, although there was something different. The house next door seemed an eerie sense of isolation. It was old. With no one around, the house felt faded and the yard was overgrown and almost alive. In the few days Sarah had never liked the attic. Sarah hadn't seen anyone come or go from the house. She always avoided it, convinced she assumed something about it wasn't right. Or maybe the owner was just a recluse. It wasn't just the dust or the dark corners. On their second night in the house, oppressive atmosphere that made her skin in the living room. She caught a glimpse of movement the sole owner of the house. A man stood in the window forever, staring directly at her. Needed to be unpacked. He was older, and with most of her gray hair and hollow eyes that sent a chill down her spine. The first night after she moved in, he didn't move. Sarah lay in bed, stood staring at the ceiling. Sarah quickly closed the curtains and tried to shake off tree branches scraped against the windows. Maybe he was just curious about the new neighbors. The pressure of the storm, she thought, and Sarah pulled her blankets tighter about the way he looked at her. It was then made her skin that she heard it. A faint creaking noise coming from above. In bed. Her heart skipped. She couldn't get the image of the man out of her mind. She tried to convince herself that it was just the wind, and why hadn't he introduced himself? But deep down, she knew the sound was different. Over the next few days, Sarah kept an eye on the house next door, deliberate creak, hoping to catch another glimpse of the man or something. She didn't see him again up there. But every time she stepped outside, she told herself, she felt like she was being watched. It's just an old house. It was an unsettling feeling, like someone's eyes were constantly following her. The next morning, no one was there. Sarah decided to face her fear and venture into the attic. Sarah decided to take Lily to the park to sweep away the cobwebs. As she was buckling her daughter into the staircase, she noticed something colder as she ascended. A figure standing in the window of the neighbor's attic door. It was the same man, came out staring at them. Puffs. His face was exactly how she remembered it. He didn't blink or move. Dusty, just stood there and filled with old furniture and boxes. Sarah felt a surge of unease. But as she swept her flashlight across the room, she hurriedly finished strapping Lily in and got into the car. In the middle of the dusty house one last time before pulling away, Sarah froze. The man was still there, fresh, watching from one side of the attic to the other. When they returned from the park, but there was no sign of anyone else in the house. Standing at the same window to inspect them closer. He hadn't moved all day. They were too big to be hers. She felt a knot of fear, and they looked like they belonged to a man. What kind of person spends all day standing at a window? No one had been staring at his neighbors, and she hadn't been up there until now. Sarah told Jack about the man. Sarah quickly grabbed the box she needed and hurried back downstairs. She said, her voice trembling. She locked the attic door behind her. Jack shrugged at the strange discovery. Maybe he's just lonely. But that night, the creaking returned. Some people are like that, you know? The noises from the attic grew more frequent as the days passed. But it feels wrong. It started with the occasional creak. But he doesn't escalate. He doesn't move in shuffling sounds that echo through the house waiting for something. Jack tried to reassure her, lying awake, staring at the ceiling. I'll go over tomorrow and introduce myself. The moment the noises would start again. Maybe once we talk to him, you'll feel better. One particularly stormy night, the noises were louder than ever. But Sarah wasn't convinced. It sounded like something was being dragged across the next door. And then they couldn't shake the sense that something had fallen over. Very wrong. Sarah's blood ran cold. That night, Sarah was jolted awake by a loud noise coming from Lily's police. But then she heard a soft down the hall, heart pounding but unmistakable. Found Lily sitting coming from the attic, crying. She shot up in bed. What's wrong, sweetie? Her heart pounding in her chest. Scooping her daughter into her arms, she whispered to herself. Lily pointed toward the window, gripping her phone tightly. The man. It was impossible. The man was locked all the doors and windows before going to bed. But Sarah's blood ran cold. It was so real. She rushed to the window, gathering her courage. Back the curtains. Sarah crept out of bed and made her way toward the attic staircase. The backyard was empty. She paused at the bottom, listening. In the pale glow of the voice was still there, speaking in low, unintelligible whispers. Sarah said, her hands trembled as she reached for the doorknob. It was just a bad dream. She turned it slowly. The door creaking as it opened. Her eyes wide with fear. As she stepped into the attic, the whispering stopped. No, Mommy, he was there. The room was dark. He was standing right outside my window. From her flashlight. Sarah's heart raced as she checked the locks on the windows and there was no one there. Just everything was old furniture and boxes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Lily had seen something. But then, in the far corner of the attic, she saw it. She spent the rest of the night sitting in Lily's room, watching the darkness, but standing completely still. It wasn't a trick of the light. Sarah told Jack what had happened. Watching her, Lily saw Sarah's breath hitched as the shadow outside her window. Slowly gliding toward her, his brow Sarah slammed the attic door shut and bolted down the stairs. Are you sure? Her heart racing faster than her imagination. She knew what she saw. She was terrified. There was something, or someone watching us. but how could that feel safe here anymore? She was the only one living in the house. Jack decided to take matters into his own hands. Sarah barely slept. He walked over to the neighbor's house that afternoon and more persistent on the door than ever. No one answered. There were scratches. He knocked again, louder this time, and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Frustrated, she could feel eyes on the front window. Even when she was in the kitchen, was dark, the bathroom or the living room. He couldn't see anything. No matter where she went, he didn't answer. The presence followed her, Jack said when he returned. One evening, maybe while sitting in the living room or something, she noticed something else. But Sarah wasn't. Her family's old photo albums. She had seen the man too many times. Confused, she searched the entire house, but they were nowhere to be found. He was there. Somewhere inside that house, she returned to the attic, going anywhere. Despite the fear gnawing determined at her, to find out more about the man next door, where the shadowy started asking the other neighbors. She found the photo albums stacked. Most of them didn't know much. Only that he had lived in the house for years and kept to himself. The faces of her family had been scratched out. Some even thought the house was abandoned. Only her face remained elderly untouched in the photos. Mrs. Thompson. Sarah's hands trembled as she flipped through the albums. That house has always been strange. Why was this happening? She said. Who or what was targeting her? The man who lives there. Breeze swept. His name is Mr. Grayson, and the door slammed shut behind her. Used to be friendly. She spun around, but there was no one there. After his wife died, the shadow was stopped coming outside, but she could feel its presence. People say he lost his mind after that, just out of sight. I haven't seen him in years. Desperate for answers, Sarah did some research on the house. She contacted an old Mr. Grayson and Mrs. Jensen, who was the man she had seen watching them from the window. Over tea, and why did he seem so interested in her chilling story? That night, your house. Sarah couldn't sleep. Mrs. Jensen said she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Decades ago, a man lived in the attic. Was Mr. Grayson really still living next door? He was a troubled soul, or had something else taken his place? Obsessed with the previous owners. They say he became so attached to the family that he couldn't let go, coming from the backyard. Even after they tried to move away. Her heart skipped a beat as she listened, straining to hear. Behind. Alone, the sound grew louder until the day he died. Footsteps, Sarah's stomach twisted, deliberate, and no one told my parents this when they bought the house. She sat up, her breath catching, and shook her head. Your parents didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, so they didn't care about Sarah's pulse raced as she grabbed her phone and called Jack's name. John Harper never left before she could wake him. He's still there. The sound of a door creaking open filled the room. The pieces began to fall into place. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she shook Jack awake. The scratches on the photos. Someone's in the house. It was John Harper, she whispered. He was still obsessed, trembling with fear, still clinging to the family he had once fixated on, rubbing his eyes. He had latched onto Sarah. What? With the truth now out in the open, I heard Sarah the back door open. Had to confront Sarah the entity in the attic, rising in her voice. Armed with sage and a priest's blessing, she climbed the stairs. One baseball bat he kept under the bed. The attic was darker than usual. The air thick with an oppressive energy. Her hands shaking as she clutched her phone. The cleansing ritual. They moved slowly through the dark house. Her breath came out in barely audible puffs as she recited the prayers. Her voice trembling. As they reached the kitchen, Jack suddenly motioned for Sarah to stay back. The shadow appeared again, rising from the corner of the room, his grip tightening on the bat. It didn't glide toward her. Ajar. It charged, rushing at her with a force that sent her stumbling backward and peering outside. But Sarah held her ground there, continuing the cleansing. I swear I heard something. John Harper, you are not welcome here. Her voice barely audible, her voice shaking. Jack checked the locks and windows. The shadow let out a low guttural moan as it recoiled. There's no one retreating to the darkest corner of the attic. His voice calm but firm. Sarah could feel its anger. Maybe it was just the wind. Desperation to stay. But she pushed forward with the ritual. With one final prayer, the shadow dissipated, vanishing into the darkness. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the man next door was somehow involved. And the attic returned to its usual stillness. The strange noises Sarah let out a shaky breath. Sarah heard her heart pounding in her chest. Doors creaking. She had done faint whispers John that seemed to come from nowhere. Banished from the house every time she looked out the window. But as Sarah descended the stairs, standing in the same spot, she couldn't shake the feeling that the entity wasn't truly gone. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. Driven it away. She had to know that it wasn't defeated. One night, in the stillness of the night, she knew deep down that the shadow in the attic might one day return. Still obsessed, with a flashlight and a sense of dread, she slipped out of her house and crept toward the neighbor's yard. Emily and her husband, David, was cold, had been searching for the perfect house for months when they finally found approached the front door. Two-story home on the outskirts of a quiet town. She reached for the door handle. The neighborhood was expecting it to be locked. The price was right, but to her surprise, the door had a charming, with a old-fashioned character. The house was dark, the ideal place to start their family. Thick with the smell of decay. But from the moment they moved in, Sarah shone her flashlight around the foyer, revealing the first few days were uneventful and cobwebs spent unpacking across the ceiling and setting up furniture. The house looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Emily loved the large backyard. As she moved deeper into the house, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. However, there was something about the house broken only by the sound of her own footsteps on the creaky floor. It was an older, crumbling building with peeling paint and overgrown weeds. The same window where she had seen the man standing so many times she could feel eyes on her every time she stepped outside. But there was no one there. The room was empty. Brushed off her concerns. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she realized something was wrong. Emily couldn't shake the feeling. Very wrong. Whenever she glanced at the neighboring house, she saw a curtain twitch in one of the upstairs sound behind her, as if someone was watching her. It happened too often to be a coincidence. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. While she was watering the plants in the backyard, she thought she heard footsteps coming from the side of the neighbor's house. It was coming from somewhere deep within the house, but there was no one there. Against her better judgment, Sarah followed the sound, as it always was, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. The whisper grew louder as she approached the door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar. Emily finally met someone from the neighboring house. With a trembling hand, Sarah pushed the door open. She was out on the porch enjoying her coffee when an older man emerged from the shadows of the house next door. But in the corner, huddled in the shadows, was the man she had seen in the gray hair and deep-set eyes. His face seemed to look right through her, his skin pale and sunken. He didn't say a word as he walked down the driveway and disappeared down the street. He looked up at her. His voice felt a chill as she watched him go. Please. She hadn't heard or seen anyone enter or leave the house before, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized it was as if the house had been abandoned for years. This man wasn't a threat. Here was this man. He was a prisoner, coming and going. Something or someone. Later that day, keeping him trapped in this house for years. About the strange encounter before she could react. Maybe he's just a recluse. Down on her shoulder. David suggested, shrugging. Sarah spun around. Not everyone is social. Her flashlight beam catching the twisted, malevolent figure of a woman standing behind her. He's always watching. Her face was twisted into a grotesque smile. David laughed, her eyes dark. You're overthinking it, Em. If it bothers you that much, why don't you go over and introduce yourself? Her flashlight falling to the floor. Maybe once you talk to him, you'll feel better. At her, her hands outstretched. Emily didn't like the idea of approaching her creepy, silent neighbor. She scrambled to her feet and ran for the door. Maybe a conversation would put her at ease. The woman's laughter echoed through the house as Sarah fled down the hallway, her breath coming in shorter. Panicked, even though she was sure she had seen the man enter the house earlier. She could hear the woman's footsteps behind her. She knocked again, closer with each passing second. Remained silent. Just as Sarah reached the front door, when she heard a cold fingers brush against her back. The front door had opened. Final burst of adrenaline, she threw open the door, see the man's face peeking out through the gap. The sound of the woman's laughter. His expression was blank, and his eyes didn't stop running until she reached her own house. Emily said, slamming the door behind her and collapsing onto the floor. I'm your new neighbor, Emily. Her body just wanted to introduce myself. She tried to catch her breath. The man didn't respond. The next morning, Sarah told Jack everything, staring at her for what felt like an eternity. But when they returned to the house without a word, it was empty. He closed the door. There was no sign of the man frozen on the porch, her heart pounding. But Sarah knew what she had seen. She had never felt so unnerved by another person still lurked in the house next door. Something about the way he looked at her made her skin crawl. A few nights later, Emily was alone in the house while David worked late. She sat in the living room flipping through channels when she heard a soft tapping noise. At first, she thought it was coming from the TV, but when she muted the sound, the tapping continued. It was coming from the window. Emily's heart raced as she crept toward the window, trying to remain calm. She peered through the curtains and gasped. The man from next door was standing in the shadows of his yard, staring directly at her window. His expression was as blank as ever, but his presence felt menacing. Emily backed away, her breath quickening. She grabbed her phone and called David, trying to keep her voice steady. David, I think the neighbor is outside, watching the house again. David sighed on the other end of the line. Em, you're letting this get to you. He's probably just standing in his own yard. You need to relax. But he's always there, Emily whispered, glancing back toward the window. It's not normal, David. I'm scared. I'll be home soon. Just stay inside, okay? Emily hung up, feeling a mixture of fear and frustration. Why didn't David believe her? She knew something was off about that man. She locked all the doors and windows, trying to shake the feeling that she was being watched. Over the next few days, Emily's fear of the neighbor escalated. She began to notice things out of place: footprints in the backyard, the garden gate slightly ajar, and strange noises at night. Every time she looked toward the neighbor's house, she saw that familiar shadow in the window, watching. One night, Emily woke up to the sound of creaking floorboards. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, but then she heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from downstairs. Her heart pounded in her chest as she nudged David awake. David, someone's in the house. David groaned and sat up, rubbing his eyes. Are you sure it's not just the wind? No, it's footsteps. I can hear them." Emily's voice trembled with fear. David grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the bedroom door, motioning for Emily to stay behind. She listened intently as he moved through the house, shining the light into every corner. After a few minutes, he returned, shaking his head. "There's no one here, Em. The doors are locked and nothing's out of place." Emily frowned. She knew what she had heard. "It felt like someone was here," she whispered. David wrapped an arm around her, trying to comfort her. "You've been stressed out. It's probably just your imagination playing tricks on you." But Emily wasn't convinced. She couldn't shake the feeling that the neighbor was somehow involved, that he had been inside the house. But how could that be? The doors were locked, and David hadn't found any signs of a break-in. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily began doing some research on the neighborhood. She spoke to a few locals, but most of them didn't know much about the man next door. Some said he had lived there for years. Others claimed he rarely left the house. No one seemed to know his name or anything about his life. Frustrated, Emily decided to take matters into her own hands. One evening, while David was out, she snuck into the neighbor's backyard. She felt a surge of adrenaline as she crept toward the window where she had seen the man watching her so many times before. Peering through the glass, Emily saw something that made her blood run cold. The living room was filled with photos, hundreds of them, taped to the walls, spread across the floor and scattered on every surface. And they were all of her. Emily stumbled back, her heart racing. She had to get out of there. She turned to run, but before she could escape, she heard the creak of a door behind her. The man was standing in the doorway, his blank expression twisted into a sinister grin. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the man stepped toward her, his grin widening. "You've been watching me, haven't you?" he said in a low, raspy voice. "I've been watching you too." Emily backed away, her mind racing. How had he gotten so close without her hearing him? Her hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone, but before she could dial for help, the man lunged at her. She screamed and ran, sprinting across the yard and into her house, slamming the door behind her. Her heart pounded as she locked all the doors and windows, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. The man was already inside. He had been inside all along. David arrived home to find Emily hysterical, babbling about the man next door and the photos in his house. He didn't believe her at first, but when he saw the fear in her eyes, he knew something was terribly wrong. Together they called the police, who searched the neighbor's house. But when they arrived, the man was gone, and so were the photos. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. Emily and David packed their bags that night and never looked back. They moved far away, leaving the creepy house and the silent neighbor behind. But Emily would never forget the feeling of being watched, the shadow in the window and the sinister grin of the man who had been living next door. And to this day, she still wonders if he's watching her from somewhere, waiting for the right moment to return. When Sarah and Jack found their dream home, they couldn't believe their luck. It was a charming two-story house on a quiet suburban street, with a picket fence, a lush backyard, and spacious rooms perfect for their growing family. After months of searching, this place felt like a fresh start, a sanctuary for them and their young daughter, Lily. The house was everything they had hoped for. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, although Sarah noticed that the house next door seemed unusually quiet. It was old. The paint was faded and the yard was overgrown. In the few days they had been moving in, Sarah hadn't seen anyone come or go from the house. She assumed it was vacant, or maybe the owner was just a recluse. But then, on their second night in the house, while Sarah was closing the curtains in the living room, she caught a glimpse of movement next door. A man stood in the window, staring directly at her. He was older, with thinning gray hair and hollow eyes that sent a chill down her spine. He didn't move, just stood there, watching. Sarah quickly closed the curtains and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. Maybe he was just curious about the new neighbors, she thought. But something about the way he looked at her made her skin crawl. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she couldn't get the image of the man out of her mind. Who was he? And why hadn't he introduced himself? Over the next few days, Sarah kept an eye on the house next door, hoping to catch another glimpse of the man. She didn't see him again, but every time she stepped outside, she felt like she was being watched. It was an unsettling feeling, like someone's eyes were constantly following her, even when no one was there. One afternoon, Sarah decided to take Lily to the park. As she was buckling her daughter into the car, she noticed something strange. A figure standing at the window of the neighbor's house. It was the same man, staring at them. His face was expressionless, and he didn't blink or move, just stood there, watching them. Sarah felt a surge of unease. She hurriedly finished strapping Lily in and got into the car, glancing at the house one last time before pulling away. The man was still there, watching. When they returned from the park, Sarah saw the man again, standing at the same window. He hadn't moved all day. She felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. What kind of person spends all day standing at a window, staring at his neighbors? That evening, Sarah told Jack about the man. "He's been watching us," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't like it." Jack shrugged. "Maybe he's just lonely. Some people are like that, you know. They don't mean any harm." "But it feels wrong," Sarah insisted. "He doesn't blink, he doesn't move. It's like he's just standing there waiting for something." Jack tried to reassure her. "I'll go over tomorrow and introduce myself. Maybe once we talk to him, you'll feel better." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She had a bad feeling about the man next door, and she couldn't shake the sense that something was very, very wrong. That night, Sarah was jolted awake by a loud noise coming from Lily's room. She rushed down the hall, heart pounding, and found Lily sitting up in bed, crying. "What's wrong, sweetie?" Sarah asked, scooping her daughter into her arms. Lily pointed toward the window. The man was looking at me," she sobbed. Sarah's blood ran cold. She rushed to the window and pulled back the curtains, but there was no one there. The backyard was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the moon. "There's no one there, Lily," Sarah said, trying to soothe her daughter. "It was just a bad dream." But Lily shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No, Mommy, he was there. He was standing right outside my window." Sarah's heart raced as she checked the locks on the windows indoors. Everything was secure, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Lily had seen something, or someone. She spent the rest of the night sitting in Lily's room watching the window, but the man never appeared. The next morning, Sarah told Jack what had happened. Lily saw him, Jack. The man was outside her window. Jack frowned, his brow furrowing in concern. "Are you sure? Maybe it was just her imagination." "No," she was terrified. "I think he's watching us. I don't feel safe here anymore." Jack decided to take matters into his own hands. He walked over to the neighbor's house that afternoon and knocked on the door. No one answered. He knocked again, louder this time, but the house remained silent. Frustrated, he peered through the front window, but the interior was dark, and he couldn't see anything. "He didn't answer," Jack said when he returned. "Maybe he's out of town or something." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She had seen the man too many times, standing in that window watching them. He was there, somewhere inside that house, and he wasn't going anywhere. Determined to find out more about the man next door, Sarah started asking the other neighbors about him. Most of them didn't know much, only that he had lived in the house for years and kept to himself. No one had seen him in months, and some even thought the house was abandoned. One elderly neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, seemed to know more. "That house has always been strange," she said, lowering her voice. "The man who lives there, his name is Mr. Grayson. He's a bit of an odd one. Used to be friendly enough, but after his wife died, he stopped coming outside. People say he lost his mind after that. I haven't seen him in years." Sarah's unease deepened. If no one had seen Mr. Grayson in years, who was the man she had seen watching them from the window? And why did he seem so interested in her family? That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions. Was Mr. Grayson really still living next door? Or had something else taken his place? Around midnight, Sarah heard a soft creaking sound coming from the backyard. Her heart skipped a beat as she listened, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, closer. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward the house. She sat up, her breath catching in her throat. The footsteps stopped just outside the window. Sarah's pulse raced as she grabbed her phone and called Jack's name. But before she could wake him, the sound of a door creaking open filled the room. The back door. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she shook Jack awake. "Someone's in the house," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Jack groaned and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What? Are you sure?" "I heard the back door open," Sarah said, panic rising in her voice. "I'm sure of it." Jack grabbed the baseball bat he kept under the bed and crept toward the hallway. Sarah followed close behind, her hands shaking as she clutched her phone. They moved slowly through the dark house, their footsteps barely audible on the creaky floorboards. As they reached the kitchen, Jack stopped and motioned for Sarah to stay back. He inched toward the back door, his grip tightening on the bat. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Jack pushed it open, peering outside, but there was no one there. "I swear I heard something," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack checked the locks and windows, but everything seemed normal. "There's no one here," he said, his voice calm but firm. Maybe it was just the wind. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She had heard footsteps, she was sure of it. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the man next door was somehow involved. Over the next few nights, the strange noises continued. Sarah heard footsteps, doors creaking, and faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Every time she looked out the window, the man next door was standing in the same spot, staring at their house. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She had to know the truth. One night, while Jack was at work, she decided to investigate the house next door. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of dread, she slipped out of her house and crept toward the neighbor's yard. The air was cold, and the wind rustled the overgrown weeds as Sarah approached the front door. Her heart raced as she reached for the door handle, half expecting it to be locked. But to her surprise, the door creaked open with a soft groan. The house was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. Sarah shone her flashlight around the foyer, revealing old, dusty furniture and cobwebs that stretched across the ceiling. The house looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. As she moved deeper into the house, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own footsteps on the creaky floor. She reached the living room and shone her flashlight toward the window, the same window where she had seen the man standing so many times before. But there was no one there. The room was empty. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she realized something was wrong. Very wrong. She turned to leave, but as she did, she heard a faint sound behind her, a soft, raspy whisper. "Help me." Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was so faint, so weak, but it was unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere deep within the house. Against her better judgment, Sarah followed the sound, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The whisper grew louder as she approached a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and a dim light flickered from within. With a trembling hand, Sarah pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and cluttered with old furniture, but in the corner, huddled in the shadows, was the man she had seen in the window. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and sunken, and his eyes were wide with terror. He looked up at her, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, help me." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the horrifying truth. This man wasn't a threat. He was a prisoner. Something or someone had been keeping him trapped in this house for years. Before she could react, a cold hand clamped down on her shoulder. Sarah spun around, her flashlight beam catching the twisted, malevolent figure of a woman standing behind her. Her face was twisted into a grotesque smile, her eyes dark and empty. Sarah screamed and stumbled backward, her flashlight falling to the floor. The woman lunged at her, her hands outstretched, but Sarah managed to dodge her grasp. She scrambled to her feet and ran for the door, her heart pounding in her ears. The woman's laughter echoed through the house as Sarah fled down the hallway, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She could hear the woman's footsteps behind her, growing closer with each passing second. Just as Sarah reached the front door, she felt the cold fingers brush against her back. With a final burst of adrenaline, she threw open the door and ran into the night, the sound of the woman's laughter fading behind her. Sarah didn't stop running until she reached her own house, slamming the door behind her and collapsing onto the floor. Her body trembled with fear as she tried to catch her breath. The next morning, Sarah told Jack everything. He didn't believe her at first, but when they returned to the house next door, it was empty. There was no sign of the man or the woman, but Sarah knew what she had seen, and she knew that something evil still lurked in the house next door, waiting for its next victim.